Welcome to Stars and Swords. I'm Alastair Stephens. This week on the show, the second of the novellas found in Nnedi Okorafor's Binti, the Complete Trilogy, Binti, Home. This follow-up story was originally published 2 years after the original novella and demonstrates, I think, at the highest level, Okorafor's commitment to character, to consequence, to grounding us in the emotional reality of Binti's experience, as well as shifting gears a little from the African futurist inclination we saw in the opening novella to a more blended African futurist, African jujuist story. This is, of course, using Okorafor's own terminology. Here she integrates some of the myth and the magic of Binti's homeland into the universe created in that first novella. One quick note, if you're reading the collected edition, as you almost certainly are, then the short story Sacred Fire appears between the first and second novellas, but we're going to cover that in our fourth and final episode of this unit because that's when it was written, that's when it was published, and arbitrary chronologies aren't anyone's friend when you're trying to do this kind of interpretive work. One quick tangent then, before we even get started. I spent some time in the last episode talking about materialism and spiritualism in Okorafor's work, and I wasn't perhaps as painstaking with my definitions as I might have been, particularly when I then started talking about materialism in the more common sense of the word, that is, the seeking of pleasure or identity or affirmation or value in the possession of things, the target-run approach to spiritual fulfillment. Which isn't, as it turns out, completely distinct from philosophical materialism, though it does kind of get things backwards. So let's zoom out just a little and refine our terms. Philosophical materialism is a kind of physicalism. Physicalism is a philosophy of existence which asserts that every single thing that exists, every single thing that there is, everything you are, everything you think, everything that can be experienced, is the product of actual, observable, physical things in the universe. You think the way you think because of actual neurons and dendrites and axons and electrical sparks inside the meat inside your head. Feelings are the products of complicated chemical cocktails. Magic and miracles and faith and dreams and imagination and love are all the products of physical processes inside and outside of us. There is nothing but the physical. And that last point is important because it doesn't just account for what there is, but precludes the possibility of there being anything else. Physicalism is a kind of ontological monism, which is to say that there is only one category of existential thing, and that thing is strictly, mechanically physical. Now, most human beings, to a greater or lesser extent, have some trouble with this. We instinctively or culturally or ideologically want to pull in something that isn't strictly physical, some faith or belief in the supernatural, in God or in gods, in magic or in superstition or in astrology or fate or karma or luck or the soul or the spirit. Some, and this is less common in Eurocentric or Anglophonic traditions, particularly after the purges of the 20th century, some philosophical or religious traditions even embrace the non-physical as the only reality, and that all the things that we believe are physical, fundamental, observable, touchable in the world around us, that these things are, in fact, the consequence of spirit or mind or some other intangible thing. These beliefs are grouped into a kind of monist idealism, contrasted with the physicalism that we were discussing. This belief says that there is only one fundamental thing, and it is not physical. That is, all physical things that we observe are a consequence of a non-physical force. Most of us, though, live in a muddy middle ground, a compromised space between the two. This is the philosophical school of dualism, or polyism, if you believe that there are more than two things which work together to create the world. The most common form of dualism is mind-body dualism, in which you believe you are both a physical body and a non-physical mind, which interact in complex ways to generate a holistic sense of you. You are your body, and you are your soul, and you are the ways in which those two things are blended. So Binti presents us with a kind of high-level dualism, as I noted last week. We begin with the fear that the transporter, a technology which is not explained even a little bit, might be compromised by sand and water. That sets the stage for a story in which the material and the immaterial are continually interacting in complicated ways. The most clear example of this in the first story is probably the Idan, which is also, of course, so important in the second novella. It's technology so old that it stops being technology, we are told. So it becomes art. It's In the desert, until it's found, Binti instinctively turns to it for protection before she knows what it is or what it can do. It seems to be powered up by the application of the Ojitse, and it both protects her physically from the Medusa while connecting her to them emotionally, communicatively, which, to emphasize, is a really interesting duality because it isolates her physically while simultaneously entangling her emotionally. That relationship is going to be pretty comprehensively inverted in the course of today's reading, but that doesn't make it any less complex. And this is why I'm so interested in this dualistic element of Binti, partly because it touches every single part of the story, from literally the first to the last, and partly because this complicated, ongoing dance of interaction is the thing which is most definitive of these stories, and by extension, the Himba-specific exploration of Okorafor's African futurist impulse. With some specific genre exceptions, Anglophonic fiction perpetuates our cultural bias toward resolution. We were just talking about this with Dickens and the Victorian desire to be comprehensive, to be unified in our literary effect. The Victorians believed that a book ought to be one complete thing, with all questions answered, all chains of cause and effect clear to the reader, all mysteries exposed, all secrets revealed. This is, I think, and you can't see it right now, but I am waving a flag that says very amateur social historian on it. This seems to me to be a product of the Western European medieval desire to categorize, to taxonomize, to quantify. It seems to me inarguable that this belief that the world can be tagged and counted leads directly to cultural, economic, and military imperialism, which reaches its peak in the Dickensian era. The world can be, this arc of history tells us, understood. Further, it tells us that understanding is good because understanding begets mastery. Define things. Name things, count things, take them apart and figure out how they work, and you have control over them. And this is encoded at the deepest level in our shared cultural traditions, in our sense of politics and morality, absolutely in our understanding of economics. It is the ideological bedrock of our fiction. From its first to its last, though, Binti presents a different perspective. And I'm going to put away that flag that I was waving because I have made a choice at this point to prioritize the story on the page, rather than comparing it to what I can learn about the Himba people in real life and about the cultural underpinnings of this incredibly complex and varied continent. This, after all, is the point of African futurism. Tell these stories which prioritize African perspectives, and what is fundamentally true will be revealed, almost incidentally. You can't help but reveal the fundamental underpinnings of your philosophy when you make fiction. And what we see, at least in the first book, is this materialist, spiritualist dualism. The physical, the modern, the ancient, the body, the earth, the spiritual, the being, the prayer, the luck, the magic, all of these things intertwined. And this is important because not only are these things irreducible, not only do they defy any attempt to be taken apart and categorized, but their interactions are cyclical in their complexity. It's not just that the material is subordinated to the spiritual, it's that the spiritual is simultaneously empowered by the material, the magical, quasi-magical power of the Adan, for example, after it is covered in the Ojitse. And the opposite is also true. I'm struggling to think of a perfect metaphor here because it isn't simply cyclical and it isn't simply fixed. It isn't constant and it isn't necessarily predictable. I suppose ultimately that they are defined tautologically by their definition, right? That this is a true dualist approach. It's a dualist approach in which both spheres, the physicalist and the idealist, are equally present and manifest in the real world. So, with all that said, with this framework established, let's get into the second novella in the series. Published 2 years after the first to a generally positive response from critics and readers, though in the most predictable reader response that I can imagine, the cliffhanger ending is pretty consistently criticized. This seems inevitable, just as inevitable as the leap from one story to three, which so often forces the production of the second and third stories as a single unit, breaking in the middle for a cliffhanger. It's a strange product of exactly the kind of ideology I think that we were discussing earlier. There's no reason that authors can't write duologies, and indeed many have, but the default modes of narrative, at least in our Anglophonic culture, are structured around threes. So when you meet with initial success, no matter how complete your story, you don't just have to perform the narrative miracle of writing another tale, but two more. Star Wars and Back to the Future and The Matrix and Pirates of the Caribbean and the Spider-Verse movies. A downbeat ending to the second part generates tension and conflict for the third, so the trilogy taken as a whole is stronger, but the experience of the second part is often weaker. And it goes deeper than that, I think. Stories in two parts are often treated as being somehow incomplete. The rhythm feels wrong to those of us who have been raised in this tripartite Aristotelian cultural landscape. Two-part series, particularly two-part adaptations, are thought to underperform. The recent adaptation of Stephen King's It, for example, was very successful in its first part, but the second part made 30% less at the box office. Denis Villeneuve's Dune has been expanded out into a somewhat unnecessary trilogy. Peter Jackson's Hobbit adaptations, originally a duology, split either at Out of the Frying Pan and Into the Fire, the escape from the goblins of the Misty Mountains, or at the end of Flies and Spiders with the dwarves being captured by Thranduil's elves of the woodland realm. Instead, Jackson splits the story into three, into a trilogy, and of course, we can't really speculate about the audience response to the pacing of a two-movie version of The Hobbit, but it's certainly true that some audiences felt that 3 movies demanded the addition of more expanded material than the structure of the story could really accommodate. It would be naive, I think, to ignore the economic pressure on writers and filmmakers to simply make more things. If 1 book is good, then 2 is better, and 3 is better still, but the ways that trilogies resonate with our own internalized sense of narrative structure is a great example of the things that Okorafor is demonstrating with Binti and with her work in general. We make these assumptions. We feel these unarticulated pressures. We have preferences that are, in part, a product of our shared culture, and then we remake our shared culture in order to prioritize those preferences. Is there something fundamentally narratively satisfying about groups of 3? Well, maybe. I can make some arguments. I can talk narrative rhythm as I understand it, as I've studied it. I can talk about the tripartite establish, confirm, subvert structure that is a little machine that generates like sparks those good feelings that we get from fiction, particularly from comedy. But the truth is that I don't know. I, too, am a product of my culture. I've been soaking in it for far too long to be able to say for sure. But what I can tell you is that these assumptions, these predilections, these fundamental aspects of our creative lives, of our narrative lives, are revealed in the creation of fiction. Okay, let's get into the specifics of the text, because just as emphatically as the first novel, Home doesn't waste any time. In fact, if you skip the marketing copy, the title of the novella itself primes you on what to expect. This is a homecoming story. And that's interesting in a couple of different ways right from the jump. In a sense, homecoming stories all operate in the same way. A traveler has departed, has been transformed, and now returns. Sometimes, rarely, you get the variation in which the traveler has departed, home has been transformed, and the traveler returns to explore the now unfamiliar, but that at a pretty fundamental level isn't a homecoming story. It's the story of a protagonist exploring a new, changed, altered space. The mythic scholars amongst you, and I know there are a few, will recognize the last part of Joseph Campbell's monomyth here, the hero's journey, in which at the end of the quest, the hero returns from the supernatural realm bearing the boon, the treasure, the gift that will save the world. The hero demonstrates a mastery of both the familiar and the unfamiliar world, and is usually reabsorbed into her community, though not, crucially, always. I remember reading when I was very young some kind of abridged and doubtless bowdlerized version of Jason and the Argonauts, and coming to the end of that story in which, spoilers, Jason sits old and alone and unhappy beneath the rotting prow of his great ship, the Argo, which breaks and falls and kills him dead. And that one left a mark on me, emotionally speaking, not just because of his death, but because of the injustice of the hero returning home only to find that he has no place there anymore. And I'll asterisk all of this by giving a very short version of a response I've given many, many times before. The hero's journey, and this is important, is a descriptivist work of comparative mythology in which Campbell brilliantly illustrates common shared features of many myths and folktales. It was not intended to be a roadmap for perfect narrative structure. It is not intended to be taken as the only narrative structure which exists. It is not an instruction manual. I have a deep respect and affection for the work of Joseph Campbell, and none at all for the work of Christopher Vogler, who took Campbell's work and published in 1992 The Writer's Journey, which takes all the wrong lessons from Campbell's work and tries to teach writers how to put together these paper-thin, narratively inflexible, cliched stories. So do, by all means, read Campbell. Do not, please, please read Vogler. I suppose if I'm going to recommend reading Campbell, I should double asterisk this by noting that Campbell takes a lot of his mythological work a step further, and he's anchoring it in a, let's say, the speculative work of Carl Jung, which may or may not be to your taste. It doesn't fundamentally change what Campbell is saying most often, but it does introduce a lot of new vocabulary. The point, though, is this. Campbell identifies the underlying truth that for all that we want characters to venture into supernatural realms, to explore and be changed and to be transformed, we also want these characters to return home because, as I've mentioned before, ultimately, we kind of want society to continue. We want heroism to be normalized and integrated. We want the exceptional to be a part of what we are collectively. When they aren't, it's almost always presented as a tragedy, as in the figure of Jason, for example. And I'm struggling to come up with any really good examples of classic hero's journey stories which conclude, and then she never went home again, and things were just awesome all the time. There may be some, but none spring to mind right now. So the return home is the common end to the quest plot, and it certainly fits the kind of narrative structure that we saw in the first Binti novella. The return here, though, is structured a little differently, even though we begin by observing many of the Campbellian mile markers. Binti has reached a kind of apotheosis, at least from the perspective of her younger self at the end of the first book. She doesn't initially want to return home. This is the refusal of the return, the mirror of the typical refusal of the call, which we see at the beginning of the quest structure. We then get the Magical Flight, version A here, in which the return is sanctioned and provisioned by the patrons of the hero, and then, ultimately, it's down to the crossing of the return threshold, of which Campbell says, quote, "The returning hero, to complete his adventure, must survive the impact of the world," end quote. And we might consider here the compared fates of two of literature's greatest returning heroes. Samwise Gamgee survives the impact, reintegrates into his society, and lives happily ever after. Frodo Baggins, wounded in his soul by the bearing of the ring and the damage done by the Morgul blade, does not. So, by setting Binti's return home as a relatively high-stakes encounter, Okorafor is actually doing something very interesting. She's enfolding an entire second instance of the hero's journey inside the end of the first. She pulls Binti out of the comfort of the community she knew by prioritizing her pilgrimage and her contact with the desert people, which is itself, by the way, a textbook kind of Campbellian heroic journey. And given the emphasis that we've put on Binti's identity as a young woman, as a harmonizer, as a younger daughter, as a member of the Himba people, as someone connected to the land of her birth, and simultaneously someone who has been physically transformed and, as we discussed last week, has adapted the rituals of her homeland to preserve their meaning but not their actual physical specificity. We'll remember that the Ojitse that Binti is now using is crafted from the soil of the planet which is home to the university, not the land of her people. We're also splitting our focus by bringing Okwu to Earth and exploring the conflict between the Meduse and the Kush, most of which exists in order to set up the third novella in the series. So, structurally, the novel is doing something really interesting, and it's something which grows organically out of the structure of the first novella, but I have to confess, this is, I think, my least favorite of the three. It's in no way bad, but the decision to structure it this way has some consequences which drain some of the life out of the beginning of the story. We demand a focus on the Okwu story, which inevitably sidelines Binti and her growth, and if you couple that with the ending, you wind up with a story that is only really, truly, deeply satisfying in its middle part. If I have to shake it out, I think that the Okwu plot in the last third is the weakest. All of the foreshadowing of the third novella, I think, is the weakest, and we would be left with a stronger story, though not, crucially, the story that Okorafor is setting out to tell, if that strand had been cut. Okay, here, 20 minutes into our recording, let's look specifically at the beginning of this text. It's a year after the end of the first novella, and things have moved on. Binti is treeing and somehow opens her Adan in an attempt to communicate with it. She faces a vision of empty space that challenges her on her name, and then returns all at once to the classroom. Some mixed foreshadowing here. One of the things that stands out, besides the strange behavior of the Adan, Binti's ungrounded anger and the depth of her mathematically induced trance state, is Binti's thought as she returns to her body. Quote, "I was so angry, I thought. Why was I so angry? It was a horrible feeling, that fury. Back home, the priestesses of the Seven might even have called this level of anger unclean." End quote. So, immediately, even here, even so far out into space, we're connecting Binti with her home, with her spirituality, and with the moral framework that is built out from that spirituality. The existence of priestesses of the Seven might challenge our understanding from the first book that the Seven are simply ancestor spirits. Certainly they are not the same as God, judging textually from the first book, but the existence of a priestess class implies a formal structure to religious observance. We'll note too the moral instruction that flows forth from that. Anger is a bad thing, and bad things are presented as being unclean. That connects with the value we'd previously put on harmony. Anger is fundamentally disharmonious. It is discordant. And we'll spend some time with anger in this story and perhaps frame it out a little later in our discussion. I'm going to footnote here the character of Professor Okpala, who was introduced to us at the end of the first novella as the head of the mathematics department at Uni. We know from that introduction that she is Kush, but that is not repeated here at the beginning of this novella. Rather, we get the intriguing detail that she is Tamazite, a word which most readers, including me, will be unfamiliar with. The word is unusual enough, exotic enough, and the context is such that we might be inclined to read it as a piece of sci-fi terminology, a word for an alien race or something else invented by Okorafor. Until that is, Binti points out that her father knows Tamazite people, which immediately anchors us back on Earth. And that is appropriate because Tamazite is a North African language group. I mention this because it's a really masterful demonstration of the depth and the diversity and the heterogeneous approach that Okorafor takes to her world building. Even if we don't remember Okpala from the end of the first book, which we might not if we're contemporary readers who are coming to these novellas 2 years apart, we get this lovely, deft, expository touch that depends on what we already know to fill in more detail. It is pure African futurism. We're also going to tag this with the observation that Okpala is wise and benevolent and connected to the math that Binti prizes so highly and also to the mysteries of the Idan. In this way, we can differentiate between Okpala and the other Kush that we have met in the series thus far. Being at Uni has either transformed Okpala or Okpala has found a truer home here than on Earth with the rest of her people. This is, as the title of the novella suggests, extremely thematically significant. What, where, who is home? We get the acknowledged foreshadowing from Okpala that Binti must be careful because she is weak, and this is the first time that it becomes clear that the quasi-magical powers of math aren't just a metaphor that Binti is using to explain a deeper intuition. Rather, math, as Binti understands it, as it is practiced at Uni, is like a religious tradition. It has a moral aspect, it has a mystical aspect, and in addition to Binti's prayers to God and the Seven, we can also see treeing as a kind of, well, I was going to say secular prayer, but I honestly don't know how secular it is at this point. I don't know how different it is for Binti than praying to God or praying to the Seven. At the end of the first part of this novella, Binti will note that Professor Okpala has instructed her to perform 10 good deeds, quote, as part of being a good math student, end quote, and then consciously aligns that instruction with the requirement that she perform a great deed, capital G, capital D, in preparation for her pilgrimage. So math is also being held as something profound. It is literal, it is rooted in the physical, it is logical, it is pedantic, it is rigorous, but in its iteration, in its tessellation, it opens up the spiritual aspect, which, interestingly, also carries with it that moral obligation of the traditional religious instruction. This diversity, I think, is part of the reason that Okorafor's approach to dualism is as rich and deep and rewarding as it is, because there isn't a single unified physicalism, and there isn't, crucially, a single unified idealism. Instead, we are dealing with multiple perspectives on both the material and the immaterial. Then we're out into the university at large, noting here again the use of living and organic technologies. I absolutely love the detail that the shuttle is lubricated by a substance known as, quote, narrow escape, end quote, which means that the substance is not itself the narrow escape, but rather a thing from which you narrowly escape. And there's a risk, I think, in a show like this that we get so deep into theme and subtext and paratext and philosophy that we lose track of the actual words on the page. So let me take this opportunity to make something extremely clear. Okorafor is very, very good, and the sometimes ungainly simplicity of the language is deliberate, it is beautifully architected, and it is oftentimes devastating. The other thing which strikes me about the opening of this novella, building on the end of the first novella, is a certain edge to Okorafor's depiction of academia. Professor Okpala is inscrutable and somewhat distant. Professor Dima, who euphemistically teaches protective weaponry, this is some real defense against the dark arts propaganda happening here. Dima is also Kush, and Binti intervenes to prevent Dima and Okru from killing each other, so obviously we're looking at how long-running conflict establishes deep prejudice and enmity, but we're also kind of poking fun a little, I suspect, at the hypocrisy of the academic institution. At the end of the last novella, there's some self-congratulatory talk about the university's dedication to honor, respect, wisdom, and knowledge as they generously decide to return the Medusa chief's stinger. And even here, as Okwa and Dima get to the brink of violence, they are both claiming that the other does not deserve a place at the university. And this is speculation on my part, but Okorafor earned in real life 2 master's degrees and a PhD at Midwestern universities, and I have been around academia long enough to recognize a certain elevation of the institution, a turning of the university itself into a symbol, into a flag that can be waved, proclaiming these pure and high-minded intellectual virtues, while the individuals within the university are often competitive or antagonistic or rivalrous. This situation, I'll admit, is a little more charged than the long-running feud about who gets the broom closet office closer to the elevator, but it feels like it could be of a similar type, a similar form. You know, the arguments that people get into on reality TV shows, on Survivor or The Bachelor or Big Brother or what have you. In shows like that, shows in which there's a social dimension, we often see a simultaneous claim being applied to both the objective moral high ground and of identity as a constituent part of the whole, an aligning of personal values with the show itself. Thus, manipulative players will deploy the accusation that other players, who are engaging in gameplay that will appear from a distance to be identical to their own, as being in the competition for, quote, the wrong reasons. They're just not here for the right reasons. This isn't what this game is about. This version of the no true Scotsman fallacy can be seen anytime people are competing with one another within the same organization. But in social reality games, as in academia, perception is everything, and the narrative genuinely does give you power. In these instances, this kind of aligning of the self with the institution is key. Thus, both Okwa and Dima are claiming that alignment while denying the integration, the right to belong to the university, the right to represent the university, to the other. If what Clausewitz said is true, that war is the continuation of politics by other means, then this is the continuation of office politics by other means. We begin the second part of the novella with a return to the beginning of the first, in fact, and Binti interacting with her transporter. What's important is that unlike her desperate prayers a year ago, now it's her anger that rises to the surface. And I guess we haven't specifically tagged the core conflict of this novella, the emotional conflict at least, and the interaction between Binti's... Well, if you read any of the discourse surrounding this book, you're going to see it described pretty consistently as Binti's PTSD following the attack of the Medusa on the third fish, but I'm always extremely reluctant to slap a diagnosis on a fictional character and behave as though that tells us something about what the character is experiencing. Yes, Binti's symptoms and experience might match a clinical diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, but resolving everything that she is experiencing down to that simple diagnosis encourages us to bring in external knowledge and to stop paying attention to what's happening on the page. That said, Binti is experiencing a new kind of emotional response to the situations in which she finds herself, a consistent and uncontrolled anger. I find it fascinating that we're so completely in Binti's point of view in this series, and yet so many of her reactions and her decisions are absent from the page. Specifically, here, the choice to return home to embark upon her pilgrimage won't be explained for a handful of pages. These decisions or realizations happen below the surface of the story, or perhaps it's more true to say that Binti's immediate experience is what takes charge of the narrative. We'll see this later as she encounters the Night Masquerade, for example, where what we get on the page is how she is feeling, and we get the description of the thing that is causing that response only afterwards. We are introduced at this point in the text to Haifa, who, if we can slip from our rigorously academic tone for just a moment, is completely awesome. I have seen some criticism of Haifa as a trans character, specifically some bad-hearted critiques that her inclusion in the story feels forced, or that it feels too contemporary, that it feels woke, that it feels extraneous to the story, but I think that Haifa is perfectly balanced in the universe that Okorafor is building out here. Identity is critical. It is personal. It is immutable. It is fundamentally sacred. Haifa's identity as a woman here is contrasted with Binti's uncertainty about her own place amongst both her people and the students of the university. But being, Haifa shows us, is enough. Sometimes you have to wait for the world to catch up. And I do think that this is a great perspective on the idealism discussion that we had earlier, because, of course, in Haifa, we are seeing the physical world conform to the spiritual truth. Her identity comes first, and her body follows after. Are we encouraged with Haifa's presence to consider Binti's transformation in the same way? I mean, yes, explicitly, textually, yes, with Haifa comparing her own process of transition and Binti's transformation after being struck with the Medusa's sting. The other detail that we get during this part of the story, and it is an enticing trap for someone like me, is this note. Quote, "A person who looked like a 2-foot-tall version of a praying mantis clicked its powerful forelegs. In a sonorous voice, it said, 'Humans, always performing.'" End quote. And you can feel it, can't you? I want to go on a run here about performance being, in a sense, the externalization of the internal quality, that it's the expression of identity, particularly in this instance as we see Haifa's joy in the power of her body, a body that wasn't always what she knew it should be, but now is. By specifying performance as an unusually human endeavor, though, we're highlighting something unusual, or perhaps at least atypical, about the way that human beings express themselves. I think here of the absence of clothing and personal style among the Meduse, as we discussed last week. Is this kind of externalization common to all human beings, according to this 2-foot-tall praying mantis? Is this aspect of performance a fundamentally human thing? Well, minor spoilers, but we're not ever really going to resolve this. We're not going to get that much more. We're not going to get more additional perspective on the matter, but I do find it fascinating, particularly if we combine this sense of performance with what we've already noted about ritual. Is Okorafor suggesting that human identity is particularly performative, not in the sense that it's inauthentic, but in the sense that it is an active verb, that identity is something you do more than something you are? It's well worth thinking about. I want to pause at the beginning of the 3rd chapter of this novella, At Home, to consider one of the more subtle ways that Okorafor orients the story around African culture and perspective, specifically the adjectival order presented to us in Binti's account here. At the beginning of this part of the story, we are told, quote, "The 2 hours we waited allowed me to shake off my landing weakness. I wore my finest red long stiff wrapper and silky orange top. My Edan and astrolabe nestled deep in the front pocket of my top." End quote. In English, there is a fixed order in which adjectives appear in order for the phrase to feel correct. An old red American car is correct, but an American red old car is not. This order has been studied and has been understood. The order is opinion, that is good, bad, beautiful, ominous, something that is subjective from the person who is speaking, then size, physical quality, then shape, age, color, origin, the material the thing is made from, its type, which is a qualifying word to distinguish this specific object from other similar objects, and then words relating to its purpose. So it's a fantastic, huge, round, new, blue Australian plastic washable decorating tarp. But if you mix up the order of those adjectives, it doesn't change the meaning of the sentence, but it sounds wrong to the Anglophonic ear. A blue, new, washable, huge, fantastic tarp just sounds wrong. Now, because I don't have experience in African languages, it's difficult to pin down whether there's a fixed adjectival order for Ochi Himba, the language that the Himba people use in real life, one of the Bantu languages. So I can't say for sure whether Okorafor is using Ochi Himba syntax here. And if you, dear listener, are an expert on Bantu languages, then please do get in touch and let me know. But regardless of its specificity, its real-world accuracy, we get a lot from the fact that it simply isn't the traditional English language order. My finest red long stiff wrapper would normally be rendered in English as my finest long red stiff wrapper. As you might be able to tell from my cadence there too, I am adding commas in a way that Okorafor does not. So this intentionality, this peculiarly African futurist intentionality, never lets us collapse Binti's actual specific perspective on the world back into an Anglophonic, Eurocentric default. It's very carefully and very beautifully done. We'll skip past Binti's actual arrival back on Earth and the tense standoff between the Kush soldiers and Oku. It's relatively plot-heavy, and the story beats are mostly what you would expect. At first, a repetition of Binti's role as peacemaker, then a subversion of that role as she faces off against her sister, Vera. There is also a sly little hook of satire through the sequence, the rich symbolism of water, the spit, the cup of water that goes rolling at the end of the confrontation, this punctuative mark, this ritual emphasis. We'll note the pseudo-organic structure of Binti's home, the route, and how it mirrors the use of organic technologies in space and at Umza Uni. But really, we're looking at this tension between Binti's family, community, society, Binti's people, and with the girl herself now that she's returned. And it can be easy, I think, to read this as an aspect of that aforementioned African futurist vision. But there's something more happening here in that I don't take any of these confrontations to be Himba-specific, but rather representative of a kind of culture that many of us reading this book have been disconnected from. For the vast majority of cultures in human history, mobility was severely limited. Indeed, it wasn't even necessarily desirable. In Britain, you will encounter, as you travel the land, you will encounter changes in dialect, in tradition, in courtesy, in society, every 25 or 30 miles, because that is how far a person could travel in a day for the overwhelming majority of British history. This is true across most of Europe. In fact, people stayed home. It's one of the things that makes the American culture of physical mobility and social diaspora so specific, so important to our understanding of what being American is, and not just our understanding, fellow and theoretical visitor to these strange shores, but to the American concept of their own national identity. Americans move around, but most of us, through most of history, did not. So what Okorafor is doing here, very deftly, I think, is rejecting a modern young adult reading of Binti's culture and instead looking more carefully at what she is actually feeling and navigating. She isn't rejecting the small, tight-knit community she left behind because there's anything inherently wrong with small, tight-knit communities. Rather, she fears that she doesn't fit there. This is the Campbellian return threshold. This is the barrier between the supernatural world and the return to the natural. This is where we learn if there has been a price paid for Binti's independence and courage, if Binti is a Frodo or a Sam. But we're still suspending this moment of return, and inside of it, as I said, embarking upon another quest entirely. As I mentioned earlier, this part of the story doesn't work quite as well for me. The homecoming, the tension between Oku and the Kush soldiers, the flare of violence, the return to the root, the condemnation of Binti's family, particularly her mother and sisters. This is some gendered work here too. Some of this is foreshadowing, some of this is framing out the rest of the conflict and the plot of the third novella. Some of it is applying additional pressure. I'm not sure that we need additional pressure here. And in the end, there just isn't as much here that is unexpected or peculiarly specific. It doesn't help that Binti, who we respect so much for her courage and for her desire to take action and for her connection with the world around her, is unusually diffident and insecure through this section, which is particularly strange when we consider how urgent her Medusa-esque anger was earlier in the story. So we do a few versions of the same beats, with Binti reflecting on how distant she is from her home and how unlikely it is that she'll ever have the things that her sisters have, and this is most specifically, I suppose, realized in the person of Dele, Binti's childhood friend, who, in the space of a single year, has now turned his back on her forever. And all of this is emotionally real, and I'm never going to say that emotional transformation in a character has to be quick, clean, and simple, but yeah, it doesn't quite connect for me. And you know, that may be because I myself I'm a long way from being a teenage girl wrestling intimately with questions of identity, and maybe it's because my teenage experience was mostly gratitude that I was able to leave a home that I never felt a desire to return to. The real heart of Binti's journey, though, is contained here in a pair of really beautiful scenes, taking Oku to the lake and then the disassembly of the Adan. Oku, as I've said, is largely unnecessary in this plot rather than as a friction point to spark the conflict of the next novella, but I do genuinely love the interaction with the water of the lake, and it opens an interesting philosophical perspective, which I don't think the novel really wants to interrogate, but which is nonetheless interesting. Binti is a master harmonizer, and we'll asterisk that too, that we never get a strong sense of what master means in this sense, because when the same phrase is used to describe Binti's father, it seems to be an indicator of his position or his role in the community rather than just an indicator of skill or talent. That is, it's as much a job as a recognition of ability. Binti is also a master harmonizer and has been since she was 12, but there also seems to be a tension about her succeeding her father as master harmonizer. It is both something she is and something that she might, or perhaps should, become. In any case, Binti is a master harmonizer, and her role is to resolve conflict and bring, harmony, accord, peace, understanding, as she did back at the university, as she does upon landing back on Earth. But these things are anchored in Binti's own being, in her own perspective, and she isn't challenged in those beliefs even when she is confronted by alternative ways of living. Quote, I sat on the beach, my long skirts covering my ojitse-free legs in the twinkling green of my home lake. Traditionally, it's taboo for Himba women or girls to bathe with water, let alone openly swim in the lake. I developed a love for bathing with water in the dorms at Umza Uni, though I'd only do it when I was relatively sure no one was around. As I sat there watching Oku dance with its god, I thought about how strange it was that for me to swim in the water was taboo, and for Oku such a taboo was itself a taboo. I remember thinking, the gods are many things. End quote. The gods are many things, but Binti still lives and harmonizes largely within the moral framework of her people, and when she deviates from that standard by bathing, for example, it's with a sense of shame, not of empowerment. So we might be tempted to ask, what is the baseline for Binti's harmonizing efforts? How does she know what is morally good? What is negotiable? What's a basis for compromise? As I say, I don't think that the novella is particularly interested in tackling that as a question, and slipping into moral relativism would be a great way to turn these slim, punchy little novellas into brick-sized volumes of unending pedantry, but I find it interesting nonetheless. Later, Binti is floating amidst her mathematics in much the way that Oku was floating in the lake, and the metaphor of water runs throughout this novella, when the Adan begins to split into its component parts, and that is when things go wrong. Quote, a small yellow moth that had been fluttering about my room, attracted to the Adan's glow, flew to it now and was instantly caught up in the rotating air. Was it the presence of the moth, tumbling and fluttering between the metal triangles? I do not know. There was always so much I didn't know, but not knowing was part of it all. End quote. This small yellow moth is fascinating, not just because it seems to be a part, if not the cause, of Binti's unintended disassembly of the Adan, which is in turn what motivates her to travel into the deep desert, and which is itself, as we later learn, a relic of the Zinariah, which I'm going to admit isn't so much a detail that I love, because I find the explanation to be less evocative and magical, less fairy tale, less mythic than the idea that it was simply old, forgotten technology which had aged into art, as we discussed in last week's reading. We'll remember too, though, now that we have this perspective, that it was Binti's father that gave her the explanation of what the Adan was, and as it turns out, he might have been motivated to downplay its significance for his own reasons. The moth, though, I wonder if it is the kind of yellow that might be described as gold. I wonder if the moth appearing at this perfect time and jump-starting the plot of the rest of the novella is in any way connected to the mysterious owl which doesn't always look like an owl, which was alive when the Zinariah were in the desert, and which has, as Araya will tell us later, a task. All of this is followed by the Night Masquerade. Quote, Binti, I heard the Night Masquerade growl, girl, small girl from big space. I moaned, breathless with terror. My oldest brother, father, and grandfather had seen the Night Masquerade at different times in their lives. My father on the night he became the family master harmonizer over 2 decades ago. My oldest brother on the night he'd fought 3 Kush men in the street outside the market when they'd wrongfully accused him of stealing the fine astrolabes he'd brought to sell. And my grandfather, when he was 8 years old, on the night after he saved his whole village during a Kush raid by hacking the astrolabes of the Kush soldiers to produce an eardrum-rupturing sound. Only men and boys were said to even have the ability to see the Night Masquerade, and only those who were heroes of Himba families got to see it. No one ever spoke of what happened after seeing it. I'd never considered it. I'd never needed to. End quote. So first, let's acknowledge the reality, of the Night Masquerade, a cultural practice from Nigeria. This is where Okorafor's parents come from. It is part of her own cultural identity. This is a ritual in which an adult man tours the town naked, performing rituals, cleansing the spiritual aspect of the community, appeasing and asking for blessings from the gods. He's oftentimes accompanied by other men of the community, but women, and this is important, are strictly prevented from taking part. Even seeing the Night Masquerade, witnessing the practice, is punishable with death. How this real-life ritual becomes the more metaphorical, more magical encounter that Binti experiences is unclear. This reads comfortably, I think, as being a part of Okorafor's African jujuist instinct, that fantasy instinct, enfolding the mythological stories of African peoples into her fiction. So what can we tell about the Night Masquerade itself, this element which is so important that it gives its name to the third novella in the series? An omen of great change is what we're told, seen by what Binti evocatively refers to as heroes of Himba families. And from these examples, of course, we can see both aspects in effect. Binti's grandfather saving his village, her brother facing down the bullies, and her father becoming master harmonizer. One of these things is not like the others, and while it's entirely possible that there is simply more to the story of her father's ascent into his role, it could perhaps come with some heroic context, we might also be tempted to read this particular kind of heroism as an embracing of one's identity, an internal, intentional becoming. That seems to fit with our read. We'll note, too, that Binti's ability to see the Night Masquerade is just one more way in which she is different, not just from her people here, but from others of her gender. And I am a little unsure about the gender distinction that we're making here, because we're not really implying that heroism is a uniquely masculine trait, are we? In any case, more on the Night Masquerade next week when we get to the Night Masquerade. Binti begins her pilgrimage of sorts, even if it isn't quite the pilgrimage she expected to be undertaking, and then we flash back to her discovery of the Edan, and I really like the way that Okorafor's language transitions here into a slightly different, slightly more self-conscious, slightly more intentional narrative mode. Binti is usually focused so much on her experience first and then the account of the world second, as we just saw with the encounter with the Night Masquerade. But this is a little more architected. It works as a shift in the narrative voice. We feel here that Binti is not just telling us her story, but she is telling us a story, something that has been more packaged, more put together. We'll note the symbolism here of the pricking of the thumb, too, which echoes the pricking of her finger with the owl feather. Later in the story, it seems that the discovery of the Zinaraya demands a blood sacrifice. Let's conclude this somewhat longer than intended podcast then by talking about the reveal of the desert people, the Nnedi Zinaraya, those who have been touched by the gold people. The revelation that they were visited by extraterrestrials at the technological dawn of humanity, before most people on Earth had cell phones, for goodness sake, is a really interesting one, partly because it is such a classic, tried and true science fiction idea here given the African futurist perspective. And that's not nothing. That's one of the stated goals of Okorafor's work. Beyond the science fiction of it all, though, it really allows the story to reconceptualize identity and belonging, both by highlighting these issues for Binti, making these crisis points in her movement through the story, but also deftly interweaving this counterpoint, this counter-argument. The desert people of old were transformed by the introduction of the Zinaraya, the lowercase here, which allows them to demonstrate harmonic abilities not unlike those we've seen from Binti herself. This is the physical, communicable part of their identity. This, we're told by Araya, is why some other cultures, including the Himba, are opposed to them. Quote, Araya smiled. Oh, they know. Someone in those clans knows enough to build toxic ideas against us right into their cultures. That's really why we are so outcast, untouchable to them. To Himba and Kush, we are the savage desert people, not the Nnedi Zinaraya. No one wants our blood in their line. Anyway, the collective knows the names and faces of all your siblings and their children. End quote. And it's not quite as simple as that, though, because Araya notes that Binti's grandmother is Nnedi Zinaraya, and specifically that their clan structure is matriarchal. Therefore, Binti's father is also Nnedi Zinaraya, which makes sense. Except that Binti also carries the blood of the aliens passed from her father, which makes it clear that the matriarchal clan structure is merely social. It has no influence over the inheritance of the Zinaraya aspect. Thus, identity is both biological and cultural, or to come full circle back to our first discussion, it is both material and immaterial. It is both physical and ideological. Binti's father has the direct line back to his mother's culture and is validated by the ideas of succession and inheritance that they realize, but rejects that identity in favor of the Himba. Binti has no such cultural matriarchal connection, but embraces it anyway. And of course, as is made explicit, we're also enfolding in Binti's identity a part of the Medusa. It's no coincidence that this is the part of the book where we acknowledge and emphasize the genetic transformation inside of Binti, the passing of Medusa's genetic code, again striking this intermingled contrast between the physicalist and idealist models. And I'll note this too, because it's always gratifying when it happens, but having Araya call out the building of toxic ideas against her people right into the cultures of the Himba and the Kush, this is just an acknowledgement of the kind of ideological thinking that we've been considering since the start of this discussion. Ultimately, all of this, I think, is collapsed into something rather elegant by Araya. When Binti bemoans that she wants to identify as Himba but is already part Medusa and now will be transformed into something else, Araya responds, quote, "What will you be?" she asked. "Maybe it is not up to you." End quote. Binti thinks of home and her family, and she doesn't answer the question precisely, so let's be presumptive, shall we, and answer it for her using the text as our key. Because when we collapse the possibility space of identity, those things which we know and can understand, like Binti's Himba roots, and the things that we don't completely understand, like her partial transformation in the first novella, and those things that we don't know about and are now being revealed, like her connection back to a group of people altered by aliens, if the Venn diagram of identity is so varied and so much of it may potentially be unknown, then how can we meaningfully collapse any sense of identity into something useful? Well, I think that we've been given some pointers earlier in the story. Most clearly, I'd say, by Haifa. The pleasantly tautological proposition is that Binti is and can only be Binti. Identity is a process. It is a discovery. It is an active verb. It is an exploration, at least as much as it's a fixed thing. Even without the Medusa, Binti is now no longer the person she was at the beginning of the first book. The Himba do not leave their home. So what is a Himba who leaves her home? And deep in the heart of all of this, we get this beautiful moment when Binti actually accepts the pricking of the finger and disassociates from her body, the momentary suspension of the dualist system that we've seen throughout the book, the body and the mind intertwined no longer, now, for a moment, separate. And in that moment, she acknowledges that though this isn't the pilgrimage she intended, she is still connected to the mother Ojitse. She is still thinking of the seven, and though she will never have that experience, she's having this experience. And maybe that's not completely different. We'll return to who and what Binti is in our discussion next week of The Night Masquerade. Before we wrap up, a quick announcement about the forthcoming bonus episode of Stars and Swords. I've done a little extra reading, and it turns out that Okorafor's novel Lagoon was written partly as a critique of Neil Blomkamp's 2009 novel District 9, produced by Peter Jackson. So that is the movie that we're going to discuss. I think that makes for a really interesting conversation. I'm also going to read Lagoon for context, but I'll try to be light on the spoilers as far as that goes. District 9 shares some textual commonality with Binti, but it is more importantly a white South African post-colonial Afrofuturist story rather than Okorafor's more mythic African futurist take. So there's a lot to be made in that contrast. It's also quietly disturbing, occasionally upsetting. It is genuinely haunting. I haven't seen it basically since it came out, so it'll be a good opportunity to revisit a film which, apart from its Africanness, really set a bar for what could be done in low-budget, high-concept science fiction. So that's going to do it for this week's episode. Next week, The Night Masquerade. The following week, we'll look at Sacred Fire and finish up any outstanding business we may have left with Binti. The week after that, I'm thrilled to announce that we're going to begin a 2-week unit looking at Brian Michael Bendis' Ultimate Spider-Man from the year 2000, and after that, we embark upon our longest journey to date. We set sail for the West. We crack open the Silmarillion. I cannot wait for that. And I'm thinking about shaking up the way that I do some of these episodes, perhaps hosting some live discussions on Discord or on YouTube or on something similar. So if you have thoughts on that, please get in touch and let me know. And to assuage any fears, because I know there are some out there, I know that the Silmarillion is a dense text, but don't worry. This is going to be my only opportunity to podcast about it in my life. So we are going to take as much time as we need to do it right. And that's it for this episode. Please leave a rating or a review in your podcast app of choice, or say hi if you are listening to this on YouTube. And as always, there was no fight to fight, Araya had said. We'll see, I thought, grasping the huge camel's thick, coarse fur. We will see. Thanks for listening.